I'm grateful for the invitation to speak from a political theological perspective to address the topic of theology in a time of crisis. I'm especially excited about the public facing nature of this initiative. As the organizers at the University of Edinburgh, Sarah Lane Ritchie and Trip Fuller have noted, I hope that if you're seeing or listening, that you will consider this as an opportunity to think together. My talk will consist of 4 parts. In each part, I will describe briefly a political element and implicitly ask what is the connection of this political element with theology. I will have some responses, but will intentionally leave some connections to theology somewhat ambiguous so that we can keep thinking together. In the end, my hope is that we think of theology as a political enterprise that invites us to consider how we might better see our place in the world, love the world, and be part of healing the wounds of the world. As we get to each part, I will offer at least one anecdote to make the point. This enables us not to get lost, as it were, in abstraction. Also, so you can decide right away if you want to listen to the whole talk or not, let me lift the suspense and name the 4 political elements at the very outset. In part 1, I will describe the importance of social location. Social location is particular to each individual. Social location is the combination of factors such as gender, race, class, age, ability, religion, sexual orientation, geographical location, and so on. The big idea here is that learning and acknowledging one's own social location is a prerequisite for understanding ourselves and the world. In part 2, I will describe the debate over binaries in politics, especially one binary that many feel strongly about, namely oppressor, oppressed. The big idea here is that liberal democracies today, despite claiming to be and do otherwise, continue to perpetuate social divisions that create and further binaries. I will highlight here that recognizing and redressing the oppressor-oppressed binary is part of the Christian political theological task. In part 3, I argue that persons suffering social violence and oppression are to serve as rudders for political theological thinking. The image comes from boats that have rudders to steer them in the right direction. The claim here is that we won't find our way to freedom unless we steer our lives in solidarity with the oppressed of the world. This is what liberation theologians have called the preferential option for the poor. That is, a prior commitment to those who suffer social violence. Over against the idea that a preferential option for the poor means politics without theology, I will highlight what might even come across to some as counterintuitive, that without such a preferential option for the poor, politics, in fact, becomes devoid of theology. In part 4, the last part, I will briefly and simply lift up the Christian call to love the world. The big idea here is that political theology is a theology of love. So let me begin with part 1, social location. Social location is not a perspective. It is simply a fact. I, for instance, am Dalit, South Asian, male, heterosexual, middle class, able-bodied, and so on. Because it is a combination of factors such as gender, race, class, age, ability, religion, sexual orientation, geographical location, social location is particular to each individual. Social location is important to understand because it affects how we see ourselves and the world. Take, for instance, that I identify myself as able bodied. What does that mean? That means that I acknowledge that my place in the world as an able bodied person affects how I see the world and how I do not see the world. If I don't understand social location, I might not really understand the world. For example, I might walk into a shower and reach for the soap at almost shoulder height because that is simply the way I am used to it. If I don't find the soap at the height I generally look for it, then I think there is a problem with the bathroom. I might even curse rather than appreciate that the bathroom is handicap accessible. Now, imagine a person in a wheelchair who enters a bathroom that is not handicap accessible. The soap holder is not at a reachable height. There is no railing or other support fixed to the walls. It makes her life difficult. She might curse too and come to the conclusion that there is a problem with the bathroom. Now, a question arises: which of us is right? Saying both is the wrong answer. The fact is simply that she would be right and I would be wrong. Because I am an able bodied person and I'm used to being and moving in certain ways in the world, it would be easy for me to superimpose that reality onto other persons who are different from me in more ways than one. And yet, the truth of the matter is that human persons often do that uncritically and thereby become complicit in furthering social inequalities. This is a crisis of our time. As the philosopher Jacques Rancière has noted, disagreement today is not the conflict between one who says white and another who says black. It is the conflict between one who says white and another who also says white but does not understand the same thing by it. In his book, Inferno, An Anatomy of American Punishment, Robert A. Ferguson, professor in law, literature, and criticism at Columbia University, describes a common encounter in the classroom. He says, at Columbia Law School, I can design scenarios in prosecutorial discretion that will lead 70 students to divide sharply over proposed sentences for a given crime. Their recommendation for punishment will extend from 6 months of house arrest all the way to 20 years in prison for the same offense. Arguments over the differences are intense, and the recommenders are budding lawyers who know some criminal law. How can responsible citizens with that much knowledge come to such divergent views over the same facts? End quote. Think about that scenario for a minute. Indeed, how is it possible that responsible citizens with that much knowledge come to such divergent views over the same facts? To return to the bathroom analogy for a moment here, today's crisis is the able-bodied person and the wheelchair user both saying bathroom, but meaning two very different things. In this situation, coming to terms with social location enables the able-bodied person to say to the wheelchair user, my idea of a bathroom has excluded you. I now recognize the problem and will strive to create a more inclusive space. This changes everything. Think, for instance, about the number of times that able-bodied persons refer to something they think is not so great and use the word lame to describe it. Phrases such as saying, oh, that's so lame, can in fact be injurious to persons with disabilities or persons who are differently abled. So you see how recognizing my able-bodied privilege allows me to stop myself from causing harm. Let me offer another example I encountered personally. I sat at a table with 5 others during fellowship hour after church, after worship, and someone asked me what my research interests were. In order to keep things simple, I simply said, remembering wrongs. A medical doctor who was at the table interjected and said, "Oh, everyone has a complaint these days. Everyone has a grouse. Everyone is a victim." The doctor was visibly upset. After squirming in his seat for a while, he could not hold it in any longer. He butted in, asking a rhetorical question. Who is the voice of God in America? Who is the voice of God in America? He asked for a second time. In my mind, I was thinking, if God is portrayed in Hebrew scriptures as speaking through a donkey to Balaam, God can speak through anyone, right? So I gave him a considered theological response. It could be any of us, I said. The doctor was dissatisfied with this. After rhetorically asking, who is the voice of God in America, he went on to state, it is a black guy, Morgan Freeman. The voice of God in Hollywood is a black guy, and you still want to complain? It's all about one's attitude, he said. The medical doctor's mindset prevents him from seeing how his presumably innocent statement, from his own perspective, can in fact be humiliating to and disrespectful of the experiences of a great number of people who continue to suffer racialized discrimination and violence. What the doctor fails miserably to understand is social location. He obviously did not know that public research shows that Black children with acute pain in emergency rooms are not prescribed as much painkillers as white children. If the doctor did come to terms with social location and how differences in race yield different social realities, he would have cared enough to know better, be better, and do better. Acknowledging one's social location enables one to do precisely that, to know better, be better, and do better. And coming to terms with unequal differences is a prerequisite for understanding ourselves and the world. All of us are marked by time, history, and context. Oftentimes, time, history, and context mark persons in not so inclusive ways. They condition our imagination, they condition our habits, they condition our senses. This is why it's important to deeply consider the combination of factors such as gender, race, age, ability, sexual orientation, and a whole host of other elements. This is simply a duty that comes with being human. Part 2. Binaries. Modern nation states, despite claiming to do otherwise, continue to perpetuate social divisions. One reason why such perpetuation occurs is because liberal democracies continue to peddle the myth that all persons enjoy equal social and political standing. I'll bet that most people have heard some version of the statement, when I see you, I don't see color. I see a human person. Now, that kind of statement is cute for a Hallmark card, but is not representative of the state of the world. When COVID-19 hit the world, many were saying that COVID-19 does not discriminate based on class and race, and yet it did. When we start counting the bodies of the dead, we begin to notice that communities of color are disproportionately impacted. Nevertheless, pandemic or not, deep racialized social divisions is a crisis of our time. Structural wrongs are unfortunately not part of a bygone era. What political theologians say about human suffering today, then, is true. Social suffering is not chiefly caused by ignorance or wrong attitudes. Human suffering is caused by social exploitation and material poverty, by the cruelty of others. Pointing out binaries simply recognizes this reality. In such recognizing of reality, lifting up the oppressor-oppressed binary is part of the Christian political theological task. Judith Schlar, author of Ordinary Vices, notes how human persons often learn to shrug at violence with an attitude of indifference. This problem is perhaps what the prophet Jeremiah had in mind when he said, "They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." Let me give you an example or two from India. Caste-based discrimination and violence continues today. It is not uncommon for people to be lynched and murdered for violating dominant caste norms. For those of you who are interested, I recommend two excellent movies, both available on Netflix, Fundry and Sairat. Fundry is spelled Fandry, and Sairat is spelled Sairat, which do an excellent job of portraying the reality of caste in India today. In India, many things are markers of caste identity. Last names, what one eats, where one lives, who one hangs out with, who one votes for, who one marries. The list is endless. In India, those discriminated by caste know the reality of binaries. Formerly called and treated as untouchables and outcasts, communities at the very bottom of the caste hierarchy reject euphemisms that gloss over the oppressor-oppressed binary. The famous Gandhi used one such euphemism that Dalits have now rejected. Gandhi said that those oppressed by caste are not to be called as untouchables, but rather as Harijans, which is translated people of God. But communities that suffer and have suffered in the past caste-based discrimination reject this kind of euphemism. They say, "Thanks, but no thanks. We'll simply call ourselves Dalits," which means oppressed, crushed, broken. Dalits emphasize binaries. If they are oppressed, crushed, and broken, then it means that someone else is doing the oppressing and crushing and breaking. Binaries make people uncomfortable, and yet they are real. They make possible political assessments of reality and reveal that there are those who oppress and there are those who are oppressed. As Schlar notes again, it is not impersonal forces or institutions that commit atrocities. It is always a human being who is cruel and another who is a victim. To briefly refer back to the first part of the talk, this is why coming to terms with social location is essential. To put it in another way, people who are oppressed today are not to be dismissed as playing the caste card or playing the race card, just as the wheelchair user cannot be dismissed as playing the wheelchair card because she complains the bathroom is not accessible. It is in this connection that political theology lifts up the reality of binaries and the necessity to recognize them. Some political theorists and theologians, however, have a problem with binaries. There are actually many, but for the sake of time and focus, let me name just one: Oliver O'Donovan. O'Donovan is the author of a trilogy of books on political theology. The three books I'm referring to here are Resurrection and Moral Order, Desire of Nations, and Ways of Judgment. He's written other things as well, but I distilled these three works to briefly note how binaries make some theologians uncomfortable. O'Donovan's fear, bluntly put, is that when the oppressed constantly highlight their oppressions, the oppressed end up becoming oppressors. Cursory readings of O'Donovan might make one think that O'Donovan does not have this fear. O'Donovan says, for instance, in his book, Ways of Judgment, that the cross challenges the covenant with death which the rulers and authorities have made. Through the cross, God has taken his place alongside the dead, our victims. This is what O'Donovan says. But things get complicated quickly. In other places, O'Donovan argues that inequality is inevitable and even warns against, quote, an age that champions victims' rights. He thinks that cries for justice and redress are insatiable and lead to excessive vengeance against those perceived as oppressors. Consequently, O'Donovan's proposal to the oppressed is not remarkably different from the theological advice that John Wesley gave a slave woman who asked him, "When shall the Son of Righteousness arise on these outcasts of men with healing in his wings?" To this slave woman's question, Wesley responded by postponing hope to heaven, saying, "No one will beat or hurt you there. You will never be sick. You will never be sorry anymore, nor afraid of anything." End quote. But there's a catch. You've got to wait for heaven. Oftentimes, Christians and churches participate in such problematic pursuits of hope. This is done by de-emphasizing binaries and forcing compliance in ways that pressurize persons to concede their lived experiences and perceptions of oppression while replacing them with required positive, so-called positive responses. This brings me to part 3. Persons suffering social violence and oppression are to serve as rudders for political theological thinking. As I mentioned before, the image here comes from boats that have rudders to steer them in the right direction. We will not find our way to freedom unless we steer our lives in solidarity with the oppressed of the world. Liberation theologians have called such a posture the preferential option for the poor. That is a prior commitment to those who suffer social violence. Some think that such a commitment is simply politics without theology. They argue that political or liberation theologies are outmoded approaches in modern democracies because they employ binaries such as oppressor-oppressed. Political theologies are thus dismissed for being exclusivistic. This is the theological version of what is expressed in popular language as reverse discrimination or reverse racism. Some who criticize political theologies as being parochial or narrow because of the oppressor-oppressed binary prefer to not use the words political or liberation at all. They'd rather simply say public theology. Such opponents of political theology label the politics of those who suffer social violence as narrow identity-based politics, as a mere jockeying for power of another special interest group. Now, this is wishful thinking, not different from the doctor's thinking at coffee hour after worship that I described in part 1. I call such wishful thinking, the theological version of it, theological cosmopolitanism. Resisting such theological cosmopolitanism, Christians need to guard against sentimental and idealized visions of societal relations. A hurry to overcome the troubles and antagonisms of the past often tends to gloss over real differences that need long-term address and redress. The rush then to theological cosmopolitanism, ironically and problematically, often ends up reifying the very oppressed oppressor binary that such cosmopolitanism seeks to overcome in the first place. Theological and political cosmopolitanism then is not just naive, which it is, but also functions to conceal the wounds of the world. One wound that has recently revealed itself conspicuously and in all its ancient ugliness is the wound of racism. Racism is an old wound that has never been healed because it is constantly covered up. It has been covered up for too long. One of these covers is a false piety that produces political apathy. Listen to this description by Paula Ionide, who came to the United States at the age of 10 as a Romanian immigrant. Ionide describes her observations on race relations as she encountered them among religious people in America, but one could certainly add other people in other parts of the world as well, to which her description applies. She writes, I felt that many around me spoke to each other in superficial and contrived tones. At first, I thought this tonal difference had to do with my limited knowledge of the English language. Even after I became fluent, however, the tonal quality continued to bother me, and I kept waiting for the moment when they would stop pretending. I had the constant suspicion that people were hiding something and were talking in exaggerated, strained inflections in order to cover up some secret. I felt as if I were in a game where everything white Americans said had a secondary coded meaning that I could not grasp. Ionide continues, I sensed notes of hollowness in their overly jovial, high-pitched tones. They would exchange pleasantries and profess love and fellowship, but their words seemed to be very abstract, divorced from actual realities, and deeply concerned with appearances. I was disoriented by the churchgoer's preoccupation with the aesthetics of looking like a loving church, because I could not understand what motivated this preoccupation. Even as a teenager, Ionide notes, the social interactions felt fake to me and therefore spiritually inauthentic, but I could not locate what prompted this feeling. End quote. Such inauthenticity is encountered because the wounds of the world are concealed rather than exposed. When, however, we steer our lives in solidarity with the oppressed of the world, we will be in the business of exposing rather than concealing, healing rather than wounding. In this way, we can steer together towards freedom. The preferential option for the poor is captured in the social imagination of the Pentateuch as God's love for the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Such love necessarily involves political assessments. Political assessments are at the heart of the New Testament as well. As Meso-liberation theologian R.C. Yongte observes, when we consider the life, teaching, and praxis of Jesus, it is not possible to leave out the socio-political dimension. It is for these reasons that I argue that without lifting up a preferential option for the oppressed, without lifting up binaries, politics in fact becomes devoid of a theological impulse. This is certainly a crisis of our time. Part 4. I'm reaching the end of this talk and would like to briefly highlight the main idea in this last part, part 4 of 4, which is the Christian call to love the world. In the end, political theology is best understood as a theology of love in which Christians understand themselves as being in the world for the world. The weight of the world is not easy to bear, and that causes its own crises. One such crisis of our time is plain old indifferentism. And as the famous Indian statesman B.R. Ambedkar noted, indifferentism is the worst kind of disease that can infect a people. Political theological thinking resists indifferentism and intervenes instead with love, a love for the world that imagines new possibilities. Tribal theologian Kinifeno Rupreo Angami observes how imagination helps the human mind and heart, one might add, to arrange seemingly random scattered bits of knowledge into a new and fresh composition, which can serve as a source of inspiration to heal the wounds of the world. My hope today is that together, as listeners, as people engaged in thinking about these things, we can think together about what scattered bits of knowledge we can gather together from those made least and those made last in the world in order to reimagine the world with a political imagination. I'd like to leave us with a quote from Rubem Alves's book, I Believe in the Resurrection of the Body. We expected, Alves notes, that Jesus would talk about divine things, but Jesus talks only about human things, little ones. About the delights of heaven and the terrors of hell, only a discreet murmur, if not silence. Jesus talks about our world, about life, about our bodies. He talks about smiles and tears. End quote. The political theological call is to love the world, especially those persons in the world who are often made last and made least. These persons, their bodies, their tears. It is in solidarity with them that we will find our way to freedom. Such solidarity resists indifferentism, patronization, dismissal, and vilification. It entails instead a politics of love that calls us to think together and act together.